My nephew thought I was just a lonely old woman living in a lighthouse, an easy prey to strip of assets to pay his debts. He even hired a fake doctor to prove I was losing my mind. But he made the biggest mistake of his life. He forgot that before I retired, I spent 40 years as a forensic accountant hunting down financial predators. He wanted to play mind games? Fine. I'm about to show him what a trap without an exit looks like. My name is Magdalena Thorne, and for 40 years I made my living hunting down wolves who tried to hide in sheep's clothing. I was a forensic accountant for the federal government, which meant I spent my days staring at spreadsheets and bank statements looking for the one number that did not belong. I learned very quickly that people lie, but numbers never do. If you look at a ledger long enough, it will tell you everything about a person's soul. It will tell you about their greed and their fear and their secrets. I retired 5 years ago to get away from the lies. I moved to Thorn Point Lighthouse, which has been in my family since the 1920s. It sits on a jagged cliff overlooking the gray Atlantic Ocean, where the waves crash against the rocks with a sound like thunder that never stops. Most people would find it lonely out here, but I find it peaceful. I like the isolation. I like the smell of the salt spray that coats the windows every morning, and the sound of the wind howling around the lantern room at night. It is a clean life. A simple life. Or at least it was until this morning. I was sitting on my porch, wrapped in a heavy wool cardigan with a mug of black coffee warming my hands. The mist was lifting off the water, and I could see the lobster boats heading out to check their traps. I was knitting a scarf because people expect an old woman to knit. They see the needles clicking, and the gray hair, and they assume I am soft and harmless. They forget that knitting needles are sharp, and that I have spent a lifetime untangling knots that were much more complicated than yarn. The mail carrier is a young man named Timothy, who drives his truck up the long gravel driveway 3 times a week. Usually he just waves and leaves the bundle in the box by the road, but today, he walked all the way up to the porch. He looked nervous. He held out a single envelope and told me that it required a signature. I set down my coffee and looked at the envelope. It was thick and made of expensive cream-colored paper. The handwriting on the front was familiar. It was messy and rushed with loops that leaned too far to the right. It was the handwriting of my nephew Elias. I had not seen Elias in 3 years. The last time we spoke, he was asking me for a loan to invest in a cryptocurrency startup that failed 2 months later. Elias was a man who chased golden shadows. He wanted the lifestyle of a billionaire, but he lacked the discipline to work for it. He was charming and handsome and utterly hollow. I thanked Timothy and signed the receipt. I did not open the letter immediately. Instead, I held it up to the sunlight. A forensic accountant looks at the container before examining the contents. I noticed the return address in the top left corner. It did not say Elias Thorne. It said Sterling and Blackwood Real Estate Attorneys. My stomach tightened. A nephew does not write a birthday letter to his favorite aunt using the stationery of a real estate law firm. Not unless he is planning something. Not unless he is desperate. I used a silver letter opener to slice the top of the envelope. I pulled out the card. It was a birthday card featuring a generic picture of a bouquet of flowers. Inside, Elias had written a message about how much he missed me, and how he and his wife Sierra were coming to visit for the weekend to celebrate my 68th birthday. He said they wanted to spoil me. He said they wanted to make sure I was safe out here all alone. I read the words again. Safe, spoil, alone. These were not words of affection. They were words of assessment. I looked at the date. My birthday was not for another 3 weeks. They were coming early. They were coming tomorrow. I put the letter down and picked up my knitting needles. The rhythmic clicking sound usually calmed me, but today it sounded like a clock ticking down. I looked out at the ocean and I knew that the storm was coming. It wasn't the weather I was worried about. It was the family reunion. Elias was coming for something, and I had a sinking feeling that he wasn't leaving until he got it. I stood up and walked into the house. I needed to prepare. If Elias thought he was coming to visit a helpless old woman, he was in for a very rude awakening. The arrival of the wolves was announced not by a howl, but by the grinding sound of an expensive sports car bottoming out on my gravel driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as a sleek black convertible maneuvered carefully around the potholes I had intentionally left unfilled. It was a ridiculous car for this part of the coast. The salt air would eat the paint in a month, and the suspension was far too stiff for the rugged terrain. It was a car bought by a man who cared more about how he looked arriving than whether he could actually get there. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and stepped out onto the porch just as the engine cut out. The silence that followed was heavy. The door opened and Elias stepped out. He was wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly heating bill and loafers made of soft Italian leather. He looked handsome in the way a politician looks handsome. His smile was bright and practiced, but it did not reach his eyes. His eyes were darting around the property, scanning the roof and the lighthouse tower and the cliffs. He looked like an appraiser, not a nephew. Then Sierra climbed out of the passenger side. She was a tall woman with hair dyed a shade of blonde that does not exist in nature. She was wearing white pants and heels that sank immediately into the mud. She let out a small squeak of annoyance and shook her foot trying to dislodge the dirt. I almost laughed, but I held it in. I needed them to think I was glad to see them. Elias walked up the steps with his arms wide open. He pulled me into a hug that was suffocating and smelled strongly of expensive cologne and stale cigarette smoke. He pulled back and held me at arm's length and gave me a look of exaggerated concern. He told me that I looked tired. He said I looked thinner than the last time he saw me. He spoke loudly and slowly as if my hearing had failed along with my bank account. Sierra came up the stairs carrying a large wicker basket wrapped in cellophane. She kissed the air next to my cheek and handed me the basket with a tight smile. She said they brought me some essentials because they knew how hard it was to get good products out here in the middle of nowhere. I looked through the plastic. There was a jar of high-intensity anti-aging cream and a bottle of vitamins for bone density and a stack of glossy brochures. I could see the top one clearly. It was for a facility called Golden Horizon Assisted Living. I felt a cold spike of anger in my chest, but I forced a smile onto my face. I invited them inside and told them I would make tea. I shuffled my feet a little more than necessary. I let my hands tremble just slightly as I held the door open. If they wanted to see a frail old woman, I would give them the performance of a lifetime. We sat in the living room, which faces the ocean. The furniture is old, but comfortable. The leather armchairs are worn soft, and the rug is faded from decades of sunlight. Sierra did not sit down. She paced around the room, running her manicured fingers over the mantel and the window frames. She was not looking at the view. She was looking at the structure. She pulled a tape measure out of her purse and started measuring the distance between the fireplace and the wall. I asked her what she was doing, and she jumped slightly. She laughed a nervous little laugh and said she was just thinking about how to brighten up the room for me. She said the dark wood was depressing and that I needed something more modern and open. She used the word open, but I knew what she really meant. She meant empty. She meant sold. Elias sat across from me and sipped the herbal tea I had made. He did not drink it because he liked it. He drank it because he needed something to do with his hands. He started talking about the city and how busy his business was. He talked about deals and mergers and acquisitions. He was lying. I could hear the hesitation in his voice. I could see the way his leg bounced up and down nervously. He wasn't a successful businessman on a vacation. He was a drowning man looking for a life raft, and he had decided that my home was going to be the wood that kept him afloat. I nodded and smiled and pretended to be impressed by his stories. I asked him if business was good, and he said it was booming. He said he had more money than he knew what to do with. It was a sloppy lie. A man with too much money does not drive a leased car to his aunt's house to give her brochures for a nursing home. He was desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. I gripped my teacup and watched Sierra measure my windows for curtains I would never buy. The game had begun. The next morning began with the smell of burning bacon. Elias was in the kitchen playing the role of the dutiful nephew. He was wearing an apron over his designer clothes and flipping eggs with a spatula that he held like a foreign object. He told me to sit down and relax because he was taking care of everything. He said I deserved a break from all the hard work of maintaining such a big house. I sat at the table and watched him. I noticed that my daily expense ledger, which always sits on the corner of the counter next to the fruit bowl, was gone. I asked him if he had seen it. I keep a strict record of every penny I spend. It is a habit from my days at the IRS where a single missing decimal point could mean a prison sentence. Elias frowned and turned around. He told me that there was no book on the counter when he came in. He said I probably left it in the library, or maybe even the bathroom. He said it with a tone of gentle pity. He said that people often start misplacing things when they get overwhelmed. I felt a flash of irritation, but I swallowed it down with a sip of lukewarm orange juice. I knew exactly where that ledger was. I had placed it there last night after logging the cost of the electricity bill. But I stood up and pretended to look for it. I checked the library and the hallway. I checked the bathroom. When I came back to the kitchen, Elias was holding the ledger up with a triumphant smile. He said he found it in the refrigerator next to the milk. He shook his head and chuckled softly. He asked me if I often put my paperwork in the fridge. He looked at Sierra, who was sitting at the table picking at a piece of dry toast. She gave him a knowing look. A look that said, "See, I told you she was losing it." They were trying to construct a narrative of senility. They wanted to paint a picture of an old woman who could no longer be trusted to care for herself, let alone a prime piece of coastal real estate. Later that afternoon, the gaslighting intensified. I went to take my blood pressure medication, which I keep in a pill organizer on the nightstand. The Wednesday compartment was empty. I knew I had not taken it yet. I am methodical about my health. I take my pill at 10 o'clock exactly every single day. I walked out to the living room where Elias was staring at his phone. I asked him if anyone had been in my room. He looked up and his face was a mask of concern. He asked me if I was sure I hadn't taken it. He said, "Maybe I took it and forgot." He said, memory lapses were a common side effect of aging. He suggested that maybe it was unsafe for me to be managing my own medication without supervision. He dropped the word unsafe into the conversation like a heavy stone. He said the cliffs were steep and the stairs were slippery, and if I was forgetting things like pills and ledgers, then maybe living alone on a jagged rock was a recipe for disaster. I let my shoulders slump. I let my voice waver. I told him he might be right. I told him I felt so confused lately. I saw the gleam of victory in his eyes. He thought he had broken me. He thought I was ready to sign whatever paper he put in front of me just to feel safe again. But he made one critical mistake. He forgot who I used to be. You do not gaslight a forensic accountant. We document everything. We verify everything. And we trust no one. That evening, while they were taking a walk along the cliffs to discuss whatever scheme they were hatching, I went into my sewing room. Inside a box marked "Old Yarn," I have a small collection of equipment from my previous life. I pulled out a small wireless camera. It was no bigger than a button. I walked into the library, which is the heart of the house. It is where all the important documents are kept. I placed the camera on the bookshelf nestled between two dusty volumes of maritime history. The lens was hidden perfectly in the shadow of the book spine. I went back to my room and opened my laptop. I connected to the feed. The image was crisp and clear. It covered the entire room, including the desk and the safe in the corner. I sat back and watched the screen. If Elias and Sierra wanted to play games with my reality, I was going to record every single move they made. I was going to let them think they were the ones writing the script. But I was the one holding the camera. The next afternoon, Elias and Sierra announced that they were going into town to do some sightseeing. They claimed they wanted to look at the local art galleries and maybe buy some fresh seafood for dinner. I knew this was a lie because neither of them cared about art unless it was an investment, and Sierra refused to eat anything that hadn't been vacuum sealed in a factory. They were going to meet someone. I could tell by the way Elias kept checking his watch and the way Sierra was clutching a large manila folder against her chest as if it contained state secrets. I waved goodbye from the porch and waited until the black convertible disappeared around the bend of the cliff road. As soon as the sound of the engine faded into the roar of the ocean, I dropped my hand and my posture straightened. The confused old woman vanished, and Magdalena Thorne, the auditor, took her place. I walked briskly to the guest room where they were staying. It was the room that used to belong to my brother. It still smelled of old cedar and sea salt, but now it was overlaid with the chemical scent of Sierra's hairspray. I went straight to the closet. Elias had left his briefcase on the top shelf. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship made of dark cognac leather with brass fittings. It was locked, of course. Most people assume a locked briefcase is secure, but to me, a lock is just a question waiting for an answer. During my years working with federal agents, I picked up a few skills that were not strictly accounting. I knew that most personal briefcases use simple tumblers that could be raked open in seconds. I pulled 2 hairpins from my bun and stripped off the plastic tips with my teeth. I inserted the first pin to apply tension and used the second to feel for the pins inside the mechanism. I worked by feel and sound. Click, click, click. The latch sprang open with a satisfying snap that echoed in the quiet room. I opened the lid and stared at the contents. There were no clothes or toiletries. It was just paper, stacks and stacks of paper. I began to sift through them with gloved hands so I would not leave fingerprints. The first document I pulled out was a large folded blueprint. I spread it out on the bed. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained steady. It was an architectural rendering titled Thorn Point Resort and Spa. I stared at the drawing in horror. My home was gone. The lighthouse was there, but it had been gutted and turned into a novelty cocktail bar. The cliffs where the seagulls nested were covered in concrete terracing and infinity pools. The wild, rugged beauty of the point had been sanitized and packaged for tourists who wanted to drink overpriced champagne while looking at a tamed ocean. I folded the map and put it aside. I dug deeper. Underneath the blueprints, I found a legal document that made my blood run cold. It was a power of attorney form. It was fully filled out and waiting for a signature. The text was dense and filled with legal jargon, but I knew exactly what it meant. It stated that due to my severe mental incapacitation and inability to manage my own affairs, full control of my assets and property would be transferred to my next of kin. That meant Elias. There was a medical addendum attached to the back. It was a statement declaring me incompetent signed by a Dr. Aris. I had never met a Dr. Aris in my life. The date on the signature was for tomorrow. They had the paperwork ready before the examination had even happened. I felt a cold fury rising up from my stomach. This was not just about money. This was an erasure. They were planning to strip me of my agency and my dignity and my home. They were going to lock me away in that assisted living facility and bulldoze my life so they could pay off their debts. I took out my phone and photographed every single page. I made sure the text was legible. I photographed the blueprints. I photographed the lock. Then I carefully placed everything back exactly as I had found it. I aligned the edges of the papers. I wiped the brass latch with the hem of my skirt. I clicked the lock shut. I walked out of the room and went back to the kitchen. I made myself a fresh cup of tea and sat down at the table. My hands were trembling now, but not from age or fear. They were trembling with adrenaline. I knew their plan now. I knew the stakes. Elias and Sierra thought they were the predators in this house, but they had forgotten one very important rule of nature. You never corner a mother bear, and you certainly never try to steal from an old woman who has nothing left to lose but her home. Dinner that evening was a performance piece titled Betrayal, served with a side of overcooked roast beef. Elias had told me that an old friend of his was in town and would be joining us. He said it so casually, as if people often just happened to be passing by a remote lighthouse on a dead-end road on a Tuesday night. When the doorbell rang, Elias jumped up to answer it like a puppy waiting for a treat. He returned with a man who introduced himself as Dr. Aris. He was a short man with a nervous energy and a suit that was slightly too shiny under the dining room chandelier. He had the kind of smile that politicians use when they are trying to sell you something you do not need. He shook my hand, and his palm was damp. He told me he was a specialist in geriatric wellness and that Elias had spoken so highly of me. I looked at him, and I did not see a doctor. I saw a variable in an equation that did not balance. His shoes were expensive but scuffed at the toes. His watch was a heavy gold Rolex, but the second hand ticked instead of sweeping smoothly, which meant it was a counterfeit. A successful specialist does not wear a fake watch to a client meeting. This man was not here to help me. He was a hired gun looking for a paycheck. We sat down to eat. Sierra had insisted on cooking, which meant the vegetables were raw and the meat was tough. Dr. Aris wasted no time. He barely touched his food before he started the interrogation. He tried to disguise it as polite conversation, but I recognized the structure immediately. It was the standardized mini mental state examination. He asked me if I knew what day of the week it was. He asked me who the current president was. He asked me to count backwards from 100 by sevens. Elias and Sierra watched me with predatory intensity. They were waiting for me to stumble. They were waiting for me to get angry or confused. I decided to give them what they wanted for a moment. I paused. I looked at the ceiling. I pretended to struggle with the math. I said 93 and then hesitated before saying 86. I saw Elias exchange a look with Sierra. It was a look of relief. They thought the trap was working. Then I turned my attention to the doctor. I took a sip of water and set the glass down with a deliberate click. I looked him in the eye and let my forensic gaze settle on him. I asked him where he practiced. He stuttered and said he had a private clinic in the city. I asked him about his overhead costs. I asked him if the rising malpractice insurance premiums were affecting his profit margins. He looked confused. He tried to steer the conversation back to my memory, but I did not let him. I leaned forward and spoke softly. I told him that I used to audit medical practices for the IRS. I told him that it was fascinating how many doctors tried to hide income in shell companies or offshore accounts. I told him that the most common sign of a doctor in financial trouble was when they started taking freelance consulting jobs for cash in order to pay off gambling debts or alimony. The room went very quiet. Dr. Aris turned a shade of pale that matched the mashed potatoes. He pulled at his collar. He looked at Elias with panic in his eyes. He knew that I knew. He knew that I had looked at him and seen not a medical professional, but a desperate man in a cheap suit wearing a fake watch. Elias, however, did not understand what was happening. He laughed nervously and told the doctor to ignore me. He said that I often got fixated on money and old stories from my work. He said it was just another symptom of my decline. He apologized for my rudeness. I sat back and smiled a small, vague smile. I let Elias think he was right. I let him think I was just a rambling old woman obsessing over the past. But I saw the way Dr. Aris's hand shook when he reached for his water glass. I had rattled him. I had signaled to him that he was walking into a minefield. Elias might have been too blinded by greed to see the danger, but the doctor was a survivor. He would think twice before signing that affidavit now. The first crack had appeared in their foundation, and all it took was a few questions about insurance and a hard look at a fake Rolex. The sky turned a bruised shade of purple the next morning, and the ocean looked like boiling oil. The weather report on the radio said it was a nor'easter, which is a polite name for a hurricane that has lost its name but kept its rage. The wind was already screaming around the lighthouse tower and making the old glass panes rattle in their frames. It was the kind of storm that makes you feel small and temporary. Dr. Aris had left in a hurry the night before, claiming he had an emergency at his clinic, but I knew he just wanted to get away from my questions. His departure had left Elias in a foul mood. He was pacing back and forth in the living room like a caged animal. He kept checking his phone, but the service was spotty out here on the cliffs, and the signal kept dropping. Every time the connection failed, he would curse and run his hand through his perfect hair, messing it up, until he looked almost manic. Sierra was sitting on the sofa, wrapping her arms around herself. She was not built for storms. She was a creature of climate control and shopping malls. She looked out the window at the crashing waves and asked if we should evacuate. She asked if the lighthouse was stable. I told her that this tower had stood for 100 years and had seen worse things than a little wind. I did not tell her that the foundation had been reinforced 10 years ago. I let her be afraid. Fear makes people sloppy. Around noon, the lights flickered and dimmed before buzzing back to life. Elias jumped. He realized that if the power went out, he would lose his leverage. He needed that signature, and he needed to fax the documents before the storm cut us off completely. He walked over to the sideboard and pulled a thick stack of papers out of his briefcase. He did not try to be subtle this time. He marched over to my armchair and slammed the papers down on the coffee table. He told me that we needed to handle some administrative business before the storm got worse. He said that the insurance company required an updated liability waiver because of the weather. He said it was just standard procedure to protect the property. He held out a heavy black fountain pen. He commanded me to sign at the bottom of the pages he had flagged with the yellow sticky notes. I looked at the papers. The text was dense and the font was small. It was not an insurance waiver. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was a deed transfer and a durable power of attorney. If I signed those lines, I would be signing away my life. I looked up at Elias. His face was tight and sweaty. He was not asking anymore. He was demanding. I reached out and took the pen. His shoulders relaxed slightly. He thought he had won, but then I let the pen slip through my fingers. It clattered onto the floor and rolled under the sofa. I held up my hands and showed him my knuckles. I told him that the barometric pressure from the storm was making my arthritis flare up. I told him my hands were stiff and painful, and I couldn't grip anything. I rubbed my joints and made a show of wincing. I told him I would try again later, when the pain medicine kicked in. Elias's face turned red. He got down on his knees and fished the pen out from under the couch. He tried to jam it back into my hand. He told me to just make an X if I couldn't write my name. He said it didn't have to be neat, it just had to be done. He was shouting now. The mask of the loving nephew had completely fallen away. I looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. I told him that I couldn't sign something I hadn't read. I told him that my reading glasses were upstairs in my bedroom and I didn't feel steady enough to climb the stairs while the house was shaking from the wind. I asked him if he would go get them for me. He let out a scream of frustration that was lost in a crack of thunder outside. He threw the pen down on the table and stomped towards the stairs. He was furious and focused on the task. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the obstacle. And while he was stomping up the stairs to find glasses that were actually in my pocket, I sat very still and listened to the wind. The storm was here and we were trapped. But Elias didn't realize that he was trapped in here with me, not the other way around. The stairs in the lighthouse are made of solid oak, and they have a very specific groan when someone is walking on them. I sat in my armchair and listened. I could hear Elias stomping around in the guest bedroom upstairs, and I could hear Sierra's shrill voice arguing with him. She was complaining about the cold and asking why he hadn't forced me to sign yet. He was shouting back that he was trying, but the old woman was being difficult. They were so consumed by their own panic and greed that they forgot the most basic rule of strategy, which is to never leave your rear flank unguarded. I stood up. My arthritis miraculously vanished. I moved silently across the rug to the kitchen island where Elias had left his tablet computer. It was sitting there glowing softly in the dim light of the storm. He had been using it to check the weather reports and his stock portfolio. I tapped the screen. It asked for a passcode. I did not panic. I know Elias. He is a narcissist, and narcissists always use numbers that relate to themselves. I tried his birth year. The screen shook and denied me. I tried the current year. Denied. Then I tried the simplest combination possible because Elias is also lazy. I typed 1234. The device unlocked immediately. It was almost insulting. I did not waste time looking at his photos or his browsing history. I went straight to his email application. I have spent 40 years looking at financial records and I know exactly what keywords to search for. I typed in the words audit and overdue and legal. The results filled the screen in a long red list. I opened the most recent email from a sender named Apex Capital Partners. The subject line was immediate liquidation required. I scanned the text. It was worse than I thought. Elias hadn't just made bad investments. He had been running a classic Ponzi scheme. He had taken money from new investors to pay off the old ones and skimmed a heavy percentage off the top to pay for his cars and his vacations. But the well had run dry. The investors were demanding their principal back by the end of the week, or they were going to the FBI. He needed $2 million by Friday. The lighthouse was not an inheritance to him. It was his get-out-of-jail-free card. He was willing to sell his family history and throw me into a state-run nursing home just to keep himself out of a prison cell. I felt a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It wasn't fear. It was disgust. He was a thief, a common thief in an expensive sweater. I looked at the top right corner of the screen. The Wi-Fi signal was weak because of the storm. It was flickering between 1 bar and 2. I needed to get this information off the device and into a safe place. I selected the email chain and the attached financial spreadsheets. I hit forward. I typed in my own secure encrypted email address that I use for consulting work. I hit send. The progress bar crawled across the screen. It was agonizingly slow. The wind howled outside and the floorboards creaked above me. I could hear Elias's footsteps moving towards the stairs. He was coming back. "Come on," I whispered. The blue line inched forward. 90%, 95%. I heard the heavy thud of Elias's boots on the top step. The screen flashed sent. I immediately went to the sent folder and deleted the email. Then I went to the trash folder and deleted it permanently. I locked the screen and set the tablet back on the counter, exactly 2 inches from the edge, just as I had found it. I made it back to my armchair and collapsed into it just as Elias burst into the room. He was holding my reading glasses, which he had found in the pocket of my gardening coat upstairs. He looked triumphant. He thought he had solved the problem. He handed me the glasses and the pen with a sneer. I took them with a shaking hand. I looked at him, and I saw a dead man walking. He didn't know it yet, but his life as a free man was over. I had the evidence. Now I just needed to survive the night until I could use it. The temperature in the lighthouse dropped 10 degrees in 10 minutes. The wind had found a crack in the old stone masonry and was whistling through the living room with a sound like a dying flute. The central heating system had given up hours ago, and the only source of warmth was the large stone fireplace, where a few logs were burning down to embers. I was still sitting in my chair, holding the pen that Elias had forced into my hand. I was staring at the signature line on the deed transfer document. The paper was blurring in front of my eyes, not because my vision was failing, but because I was calculating the time. I needed to stall. I needed to keep them here until the police saw the email I had sent. But Elias was standing over me like a vulture waiting for a carcass. He was tapping his foot. Tap, tap, tap. It was the rhythm of a man running out of time. Sierra was pacing by the window. She was wearing a thin silk blouse that was fashionable in the city, but useless in a nor'easter. She was hugging herself, and her teeth were actually chattering. She turned to Elias and complained that she was freezing. She said this place was a tomb. She said she couldn't feel her toes. Elias ignored her. He was too focused on the paper in my lap. Sierra let out a huff of anger and looked around the room for something to burn. The wood basket was empty. Her eyes landed on the small side table next to my reading lamp. There was a stack of old books there. They were not valuable first editions. They were just old maritime journals and tide charts. But on the very top of the stack sat the 1920s lighthouse logbook. It was a thick volume bound in cracked black leather that smelled of pipe tobacco and salt water. To the untrained eye, it looked like garbage. It looked like a rotting old book full of boring numbers about weather patterns and shipping lanes. But to me, it was the most valuable thing in the house. My late brother had been a paranoid genius. He didn't trust banks and he didn't trust computers. When he set up the family trust fund, he generated a complex 24-digit encryption key to access the offshore accounts. He didn't write it on a piece of paper or save it on a hard drive. He had hidden it inside the logbook. He had used a cipher that corresponded to the wind speeds recorded in January of 1923. Without that book, the money was gone forever. And right now, Sierra was reaching for it with a look of desperate entitlement. She grabbed the book and marched towards the fireplace. She said that at least this old junk would be good for something. She raised her hand to toss it into the dying flames. I did not think. I did not calculate. I reacted. I launched myself out of the armchair. The blanket I had been huddled under fell to the floor. I crossed the 6 feet between us in 2 strides. I didn't feel the ache in my knees or the stiffness in my hip. I reached out and clamped my hand around Sierra's wrist just as she was about to let go of the book. My grip was iron. It was the grip of a woman who has hauled lobster traps and chopped her own firewood for 5 years. Sierra shrieked. It was a high, piercing sound of pure shock. She tried to pull away, but I held fast. I twisted her wrist sharply away from the fire and snatched the book from her hand with my other hand. I stepped back, clutching the book to my chest. My breathing was heavy but steady. The room went silent. The only sound was the wind howling outside. Elias was staring at me. His mouth was slightly open. He looked from me to the empty armchair and back again. He looked at the way I was standing. My posture was not stooped. My knees were not trembling. I was standing with my feet shoulder-width apart, ready for a fight. He asked me quietly what happened to my arthritis. He asked me how a woman who couldn't hold a pen 5 minutes ago could move like a striking cobra. I realized my mistake instantly. I had broken character. I had shown them the steel underneath the wool. I had to pivot. I had to give them a reason that fit their narrative of me as a sentimental old fool. I hugged the book tighter and forced a tremor into my voice. I told them that this book belonged to my father. I told them it was the only thing I had left of him. I told them they could take the house and the land, but they could not burn my memories. I squeezed out a tear. It wasn't hard. The thought of losing that book actually did terrify me. Elias stared at me for a long moment. He was analyzing. He was suspicious. But his greed was louder than his intuition. He shook his head and laughed a cruel, dark laugh. He told Sierra to leave the book alone. He said, let the old hag keep her garbage. He said he didn't care about moldy books, he only cared about the signature. He turned back to me and pointed at the papers on the floor. He told me to sit down and sign the damn papers before he lost his patience completely. I lowered myself slowly back into the chair, clutching the logbook like a shield. I had saved the asset, but I had shown my hand. Elias knew I was stronger than I looked, and that made him more dangerous. The darkness arrived not with a whimper, but with a violent crack that sounded like a gunshot. A bolt of lightning struck the transformer down the road, and the lighthouse was plunged into immediate and total blackness. The humming of the refrigerator stopped, and the electric heater died, and the only light came from the jagged flashes of lightning that illuminated the room in terrifying strobe-like bursts. Sierra screamed. It was a panicked, childlike sound that echoed off the stone walls. She started shouting for Elias and asking where the flashlight was. I heard the sound of shins banging against coffee tables and the curse words that followed. They were stumbling around in a world they did not understand. They were city people who were used to streetlights and ambient glow. They did not know what true darkness looked like. But I did. I had lived in this lighthouse for 5 years. I knew that the floorboards in the hallway creaked on the left side, but not the right. I knew that the rug in the foyer slipped if you stepped on the corner. I knew exactly 18 steps separated the living room from the base of the spiral staircase that led up to the lantern room. I did not wait for them to find their bearings. I moved. I slipped the heavy logbook into the waistband of my skirt and wrapped my shawl tight around my shoulders. I moved silently through the blackness, guiding myself by the touch of the wall against my fingertips. I drifted past them like a ghost. I heard Elias fumbling with his phone, trying to turn on the torch function. I reached the heavy iron door of the staircase and pulled it open. It was well oiled and made no sound. I slipped inside and began to climb. The air in the stairwell was freezing. The stone walls sucked the heat out of everything. I climbed the 140 steps with a steady rhythm. My legs burned and my breath came in short, ragged gasps, but I did not stop. I needed the high ground. I needed to be in the one place where there was only one way in and one way out. I reached the lantern room at the top. This is the glass-enclosed room where the great light used to shine. Now it was just a cold observation deck surrounded by a raging storm. The wind up here was deafening. It slammed against the thick glass panes with a force that made the metal frames shudder. I walked over to the railing and looked down. I could see the beam of a flashlight dancing erratically at the bottom of the stairs. Elias was coming. I stood with my back to the glass and waited. I did not hide. There was nowhere to hide in a room made of windows. A few minutes later, the heavy door at the top of the stairs burst open. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness and hit me directly in the face, blinding me. I raised a hand to shield my eyes. Elias stepped into the room. He was breathing hard, and his hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. He looked wild. The veneer of civilization had completely washed away. He shined the light right in my eyes, keeping me disoriented. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask why I had run away. He just laughed. It was a breathless, jagged sound. He said that this was perfect. He said it was poetic that I had come up here to the top of the tower to watch my empire fall. He stepped closer. The light moved down to my hands. He saw that I was empty-handed. He asked where the book was. I told him I had dropped it on the stairs. He didn't believe me, but he didn't care. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded papers. They were crumpled now and damp with sweat. He held them out. He told me that the game was over. He stepped closer until I could smell the sour scent of his fear. He leaned in and shouted over the roar of the wind. He admitted it. He told me everything. He told me that he owed $2 million to men who did not file lawsuits, but instead broke kneecaps. He said he had 48 hours to wire the money, or he was a dead man. He looked at me with eyes that were black holes of desperation. He said he was not going to let a stubborn old woman stand between him and survival. He said he would drag me to the edge of the railing if he had to. He said he would claim I fell. He said accidents happen all the time in storms like this. I looked at him, and I realized he meant it. He had crossed the line from thief to killer. The desperation had hollowed him out until there was nothing left but instinct. He blocked the only exit. The storm raged outside, and the monster stood inside. I was cornered, but what Elias didn't know was that I wasn't waiting for him to leave. I was waiting for the time on the clock to tick past midnight. Elias stopped shouting when he saw the change in my face. He had been expecting tears or begging or the trembling of a frightened old woman. Instead, I stood up straight. I unhunched my shoulders and let my spine lengthen to its full height. I looked him dead in the eye, and the flashlight beam wavered in his hand because for the first time, he wasn't looking at his Aunt Mags. He was looking at Magdalena Thorne, the federal auditor, who had put men far smarter and far more dangerous than him behind bars. I took a step forward, and he took a step back. It was instinct. He sensed the predator in the room had changed. I spoke, and my voice was not the cracked whisper I had been using for 2 days. It was low and steady and cold as the ocean outside. I told him to put the paper down, Elias. I told him that the performance was over. I told him that I knew about the Ponzi scheme. I knew about the $2 million. I knew that he had been skimming 10% off the top of the pension funds he was supposed to be managing. I listed the names of his shell companies one by one. I recited the account numbers I had memorized from his tablet earlier that day. His jaw dropped. He looked like a man who had been slapped. He stammered and asked how I knew that. He tried to laugh it off and say I was crazy, but the fear in his eyes was real. I didn't stop. I told him I knew about Dr. Aris. I told him I knew the man was a struck-off general practitioner with a gambling problem and not a geriatric specialist. I told him that forging a medical competency test was a felony, and that kidnapping an elderly relative across state lines to force a signature was a federal crime. Elias backed up until he hit the glass wall of the lantern room. The storm raged behind him, but he was staring at me in horror. He asked what I was going to do. He asked if I was going to call the police. He looked at his phone and laughed nervously. He said I couldn't call anyone because the lines were down and there was no signal. He said he could still fix this. He said we could make a deal. I shook my head slowly. I told him there was no deal to be made. I told him that he was thinking like a criminal, but he should have been thinking like an accountant. I told him that I didn't need phone service now because I had already done the work when the power was on. I raised my wrist and tapped my watch. I told him that at 2 o'clock this afternoon, while he was upstairs searching for my reading glasses, I forwarded his entire financial history to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I told him that I also blind copied his 5 biggest investors, including the ones he was so afraid of. I lied slightly about the timing of the send, but the effect was the same. I watched the color drain out of his face. He looked like a ghost. He realized that the email had been sitting in their inboxes for hours. He realized that while he was trying to bully me into signing a deed, his entire life had already burned to the ground. He slumped against the glass. The papers slipped from his hand and fluttered to the floor. He wasn't aggressive anymore. He was just broken. He looked at me with the confusion of a child who had touched a hot stove. He asked me why I did it. He asked me how I could do that to family. I looked at him and felt nothing but a cold resolve. I told him that family does not gaslight you. Family does not try to steal your home. Family does not look at you and see a line item on a balance sheet. I told him that he made his choice when he walked through my door with a lie in his pocket. I told him that he came here looking for gold, but all he found was justice. The storm broke just before dawn. The wind died down as quickly as it had risen, and the sky turned a pale, washed-out gray. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I walked down the spiral stairs, leaving Elias slumped against the glass in the lantern room. He didn't move. He just stared out at the ocean that had failed to swallow him up. I went into the kitchen and started a pot of coffee using the gas stove. I moved with the slow, deliberate motions of a woman who has nothing left to fear. Sierra came down a few minutes later. She looked like a wreck. Her expensive makeup had run down her face in black streaks, and her hair was a tangled mess. She saw me making coffee, and she sneered. She asked me how I could be so calm. She asked me if I realized I had just ruined their lives. I didn't answer her. I just poured 3 mugs of black coffee and set them on the table. I sat down and wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic. I watched the window. I was waiting for the final act to begin. It happened at 7 o'clock exactly. I heard the low, thrumming sound of a diesel engine cutting through the morning mist. It wasn't the rhythmic chugging of a lobster boat. It was the deep, powerful roar of a government vessel. I looked out the window and saw a sleek gray boat maneuvering towards the lighthouse dock. On the side of the hull, in bold white letters, were the words United States Coast Guard. Standing on the deck were 2 men in dark windbreakers with the yellow lettering of the FBI on the back. Elias must have heard the engine too. He stumbled into the kitchen, looking like a man walking to the gallows. He looked out the window and saw the boat. His knees gave out, and he collapsed into a chair. He put his head in his hands. Sierra ran to the window. She screamed. She turned to Elias and started hitting him on the shoulder. She screamed that he told her it was safe. She screamed that she didn't know he stole the money. She was already rewriting history. She was already distancing herself. The rats were turning on each other before the ship had even fully sunk. I stayed seated. I sipped my coffee. I watched as the officers tied up the boat and walked briskly up the long wooden stairs from the dock. They moved with purpose. They weren't coming to check on our welfare. They were coming to execute a warrant. My email had obviously hit the right inboxes. When you tell the SEC that a fund manager is about to flee the country with $2 million, they tend to move very quickly. The officers knocked on the door. It was a polite but firm knock. Elias didn't move, so I stood up and walked to the door. I opened it, and the cold morning air rushed in, smelling of seaweed and rain. The lead agent showed me his badge. He asked if Elias Thorne was on the premises. I stepped aside and gestured to the kitchen table. The next 10 minutes were a blur of procedural justice. Elias offered no resistance. He stood up and let them cuff his hands behind his back. He looked small. The arrogance was gone. Sierra was not so dignified. She was crying and shouting that she was a victim. She told the agents that I was crazy. She pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that the old woman was senile and making things up. The agent looked at me. He looked at the calm way I stood by the counter. He looked at the knitting basket by my chair. Then, he looked back at the screaming woman in the designer clothes. He didn't say anything, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. He knew who the crazy one was. They led them out of the house and down the path towards the water. Elias kept his head down, but Sierra kept looking back, glaring at me with eyes full of hate. I watched them go. I watched them step onto the boat that would take them back to the mainland and back to a world of lawyers and courtrooms and prison cells. I stood in the doorway until the boat was just a speck on the horizon. The house was quiet again. The wolves had been removed. The sheep was safe. And I still had a full cup of hot coffee to enjoy. I went back inside and closed the heavy oak door. The latch clicked shut with a sound of finality. The house felt different now. The tension that had filled the rooms for the last 2 days had evaporated, leaving behind only the smell of sea salt and old wood. I walked through the living room. I picked up the pen that Elias had dropped under the table. I placed it in the trash bin. I picked up the crumpled deed transfer papers and tossed them into the fireplace. I watched the flames curl around the edges, turning the lies into ash. I went to the bookshelf and picked up the leather-bound logbook. I ran my hand over the cracked spine. Sierra had called it garbage. Elias had called it useless. They had been so blinded by the real estate value of the lighthouse that they never stopped to think about what was inside it. I carried the book out to the porch and sat in my rocking chair. The sun was fully up now, painting the ocean in shades of brilliant blue. The storm had scrubbed the air clean. I opened the book to the page dated January 15th, 1923. My brother's handwriting was crabbed and small. To anyone else, the entry looked like a report on wind velocity and barometric pressure. But I knew the cipher. I took a small notebook from my pocket and began to decode. The wind speed, north-northeast. 12 knots translated to the first 3 digits of the Swiss bank account. The temperature reading of 34 degrees gave me the next 2. Within 5 minutes, I had the full sequence written down. I dialed the number for the trust administrator in Zurich. It was a number I hadn't called in 10 years. The voice on the other end was professional and discreet. I gave him the codes. I verified my identity. He confirmed that the funds were still there untouched and accruing interest for a decade. It was a substantial amount. Enough to fix the roof, enough to repave the driveway so I wouldn't have to dodge potholes, enough to ensure that I could live out the rest of my days listening to the ocean without ever worrying about the price of heating oil again. I authorized a transfer to my local credit union. Just enough for maintenance and a new knitting machine. The rest would stay hidden. It would stay safe, just like me. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. I picked up my knitting needles. The rhythmic click-click-click began again. It was a soothing sound, a normal sound. People often ask me if I get lonely out here. They ask if I get scared living alone on a cliff edge. They think an old woman needs protection. They think we are fragile things that need to be wrapped in cotton wool and managed. But they are wrong. We are not fragile. We are fortified. We have survived decades of storms and heartbreaks and disappointments. We have learned to spot a liar from a mile away, and we know how to hide our strength until the moment it is needed. Elias and Sierra thought they were walking into a retirement home. They didn't realize they were walking into a fortress. They are gone now. The seagulls are crying overhead, and the waves are crashing below. The lighthouse is still standing, and so am I. So, that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Do you believe I was too harsh on my own flesh and blood? Or did they get exactly what they deserved for trying to prey on an elder? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.